War in the West African Colonies and the Daring Raid on Fernando Po. This is a talk that was given on the 19th of February 2021, which was during the COVID pandemic. Over the years, I've watched my fair share of Second World War films, particularly when I was growing up, and inevitably I admired some of the film stars who played the heroes. The characters they represented seemed to personify larger than life, usually physically and mentally tough, and often altruistic individuals, though not without their weaknesses and faults, which seem to embody many of the characteristics of the men and women from the Special Operations Executive. In these somewhat challenging times, I think a lot of us have drawn on the spirit of the war era. And it was in this spirit I decided to rewatch The Seawolves, a film from 1980, with a few of my favorite actors, including David Niven, Roger Moore, and Gregory Peck. I'd always known that my British grandfather had been involved in a daring raid off the coast of West Africa and understood this film was loosely based on what happened. In fact, it was principally based on another mission, Operation Creek, involving the SOE and volunteers from the Calcutta Light Horse, which took place in Goa in 1943. Lesser known is that the film was based on more than one of SOE's covert operations. The other, known as Operation Postmaster, took place in the harbour of Santa Isabel on the neutral Spanish island of Fernando Po on the 14th of January, 1942. It is this latter operation I'll be talking about this evening, setting it in the context of colonial West Africa. For an island about the size of West Sussex, its history demonstrates its strategic and its economic importance. Winston Churchill invited Dalton to take charge of the new body to control subversive warfare, commissioning the details of its founding charter to be drafted by an unlikely person in view of his reputation, no other than Neville Chamberlain. A draft was circulated on the 13th of July, 1940, and by the 22nd of July, the War Cabinet had met and approved the charter. It was Chamberlain's final act for the nation, and it was he who named the new organization Special Operations Executive. He succumbed to illness and died a few months later. My grandfather, W.F.H. Newington, known as Bill, who had joined the colonial service in 1928, was at that time district officer in the Egbe division of Abeokuta, about 50 miles north of Lagos, and he heard Chamberlain's speech on the 3rd of September 1939, announcing that Britain was at war with Germany. But his first action after the 11 o'clock announcement was to place a local German trader in detention. During the period of the phony war, little changed, save for petrol rationing. And in February 1940, my grandmother Edme even managed to sail out to join him in Africa by the Elder Dempster line. They moved to Alaro, southwest of Abeokuta, along with his fellow officers. Bill had wanted to join up, but was refused permission because his role was deemed essential. The situation in West Africa was complex, but things became particularly so when on the 3rd of July 1940, the Royal Navy attacked French ships at the naval base of Mer el Kabir in Oran on the coast of French Algeria, leading to considerable casualties. It was an attempt to prevent French ships from falling into German hands and formed part of Operation Catapult. The Atlantic ports were in German hands, and the conditions of the Franco-German armistice were such that Churchill felt compelled to issue the French with an ultimatum. And when the deadline passed, a devastating attack took place, damaging or destroying both ships and planes, with a further attack on the ships on the 8th of July. The border with Alaro was swiftly closed, which disrupted corn export from the frontier to Porto Novo and Cotonou, west of Lagos and French Dahomey, causing real hardship. So Bill sent native observers across the border into Vichy-controlled French Dahomey to bring back intelligence, the best of whom was the district interpreter, who went on a few trips returning with information on the state of the Dahomey government, as well as its military capabilities. Then several days after the naval action in Oran, Bill and Derek Fountain, who was in the colonial police intelligence based at the frontier, together with my grandmother Edme, visited Saketi across the border to assess the situation for themselves. They very nearly didn't make it because a tank trap had been placed at the bottom of a hill on the French side of the border, and the Albion lorry had rather poor brakes. Bill ordered Fountain to jump out with Edme while he hung onto the brakes and managed to stop at the edge of a hole measuring 6 feet square with a 4-foot drop. They dusted themselves off, then entered the offices of the head of the local subdivision the moment that Pétain was announcing the dissolution of the Third Republic, when Pétain was given dictatorial powers by the National Assembly. Bill recalls there being much emotion from those present, including the resident in charge of the station, with a mixture of tears along with a frequent imbibing of absinthe. They all said that if the British government moved in and paid their salaries, they'd be happy, though their loyalties were clearly divided as they told Bill the tank trap had been dug to stop pro-de Gaullists from escaping. Returning from home leave in April 1941 was a considerably more hazardous affair than it had been when Edme came out to Africa in February 1940. It entailed huge convoys facing attack from air and sea. They sailed on the Abosso from Lagos to Liverpool via Freetown in a 48-ship convoy supported by an armed merchant cruiser, 2 or 3 corvettes, and 3 American Lend-Lease destroyers. At that time, there was a deal between the UK and the US from the loan of the destroyers for access to bases. They zigzagged their way near the coast of Greenland, with Bill and others going on 2-hour submarine watch in freezing temperatures. They were lucky to reach Liverpool unscathed. In October 1942, the Abosso was sunk by a U-boat between the Azores and Greenland, with only 31 out of the 393 surviving. Bill returned to Africa alone, my grandmother remaining in England with their daughters, my mother being one of them. Even in peacetime, families frequently remained separated for long periods of time. After having children, and while my grandfather was in service in Africa until 1951, my grandparents were either separated from each other or from their children. The Duchessa d'Aosta was a sizable Italian passenger liner, which had arrived in the harbour on the 10th of June, 1940, the day that Mussolini brought Italy into the war. The captain was concerned the ship with its valuable cargo would be seized by the British along with its crew. So it was moored extremely close to the quayside, providing a bird's eye view from the British consulate, which was located right next to the cathedral. Through his contacts, Michi was able to get hold of a copy of the ship's manifest, which appeared to have 1 page missing. Both the ship's master and the Spanish Guinea government refused to divulge the contents of the missing page to the port authorities. The remainder of the cargo was valued at £221,000, and the liner up to £150,000, which is in excess of £20 million in today's money. There was a suspicion that armaments were listed on the missing page, and the ship's radio was still believed to be active, fueling concerns she could be used to track the movement of British ships and make contact with German U-boats hunting British convoys. The situation in Fernando Po was causing ever more concern. The Lecombe was taking fuel on board. The Duchessa d'Aosta had the top of the funnel painted red and water taken on board, suggesting she was being made ready to go to sea. It was discovered she was sending radio messages to a German-Swiss shipping company in Las Palmas, further fueling concerns she could form a supply fleet of German interests, and it was highly likely the governor would turn a blind eye. It was also believed that Germany could simply take over Fernando Po with or without the consent of the Spanish. By the 8th of July 1941, M in London had resolved to take action to immobilize these Axis ships. After the evacuation of troops from Dunkirk, Winston Churchill had immediately approved the setting up of a special force to raid enemy territories. The units formed were known as commandos. An early recruit was Captain Gus March Phillips, who, during the retreat from Dunkirk, found himself diving into a sandhole already occupied by Geoffrey Appleyard from the Royal Army Service Corps. While stuck in the sandhole awaiting evacuation, they formed an enduring bond. Appleyard was easily persuaded by March Phillips to join him in the new unit. March Phillips became troop commander of B Troop No. 7 Commando. He engendered fierce loyalty in his men. Great emphasis was placed on physical fitness and training at their base in Scotland. the elite unit came to the attention of M. On the 3rd of September 1939, Ian Fleming was appointed assistant to the Director of Naval Intelligence, who was Rear Admiral John Godfrey, a man who could be difficult at times. Gus March Phillips, having caught the attention of M, was recruited to the SOE along with Appleyard and other members of his elite unit. This turned them from commandos into secret agents and into an organization which officially didn't exist. March Phillips convinced M to allow him to train a specialist force of commando agents for the SOE. Appleyard was a natural choice to join him. Recruitment was always by way of a personal connection. Training took place in Dorset, and March Phillips requisitioned an old Brixham trawler named after the daughter of the fisherman who had originally owned it, named Honor. While it had been converted into a yacht, it sufficiently resembled a classic Brixham trawler to pass as one. He liked the fact it was built of wood, which would mean it was less vulnerable to magnetic mines. With an engine fitted by the owner, it had the ability to sail fast and silently, and after being requisitioned, it was turned into a Q ship, belying its innocent appearance. It was decided the trawler would sail under a Swedish flag, which was a neutral country. So they recruited Graham Hayes, a childhood friend of Appleyard's, who was an experienced sailor. He had the added advantage of speaking some Swedish, and he looked the part. Another maid-honor agent was a young Dane called Anders Lassen. He was determined to do what he could to take revenge on the Germans after their invasion of his country. While training with the SOE in Arisaig in Scotland, he was recommended to M as a suitable candidate for the Maid Honor Commandos. The Maid Honor Commandos trained in Poole Harbour, where they were visited both by M and Ian Fleming in the months they were there. W had cabled M on the 12th of July, 1940, saying that action was impossible on Fernando Po, but M knew the Maid Honor force was ready for action. This was M's secret weapon, and one he wanted to deploy in West Africa. However, the Admiralty were not impressed and had to be persuaded. The SOE were regarded as ungentlemanly and frankly dangerous. After a series of meetings with M of the SOE and Ian Fleming of Naval Intelligence, Admiral Godfrey, Fleming's boss, had agreed in principle to allow the Maid Honor to transfer from Dorset to Freetown, Sierra Leone, and sought the approval of the Admiralty, which was eventually obtained on the 26th of July, 1941. Maid Honor's journey was not without its difficulties and setbacks. They developed engine problems and found themselves stuck off the coast of West Africa in Vichy-held waters. The youngest crew member, Private Buzz Perkins, aged only 17, was the one who succeeded in getting the engine going after being becalmed for several days in great heat and with water supplies dwindling. With the engine fixed, a monsoon and some wind, it meant they eventually reached Freetown on the 21st of September after a short stop-off for provisions in Madeira. Shortly before their arrival, W had summoned Guise and Vice Consul Michi to Lagos, where they hatched a plan to seize the liner and its valuable cargo. It was Guise who had first considered the possibility of capturing the Duchess d'Aosta. With the liner not seaworthy, it couldn't be sailed out of the harbour, which was too shallow to properly sink it. So the idea of cutting out the liner was proposed, a complex and difficult operation. The Maid Honor crew arrived in an ebullient mood after their eventful voyage and joined Appleyard and other agents who had set up a training camp on Lumley Beach outside Freetown. Training was hard. West Africa was known as the white man's grave on account of the high mortality rate due to climate, disease, and sanitation, which made regular home leave necessary. The Maid Honor unit suffered their fair share of illnesses during this period of training, but March Phillips was an inspiring leader, and together with Appleyard, they got their men fighting fit. However, the local top brass, General Gifford and Admiral Willis, remained very unhappy and felt there was no good use for this unit in West Africa at all, and that the Maid Honor was not a suitable vessel for carrying out any sea missions. A cable from Admiral Godfrey in London was sent to Willis, and the Maid Honor was instructed to commence reconnaissance missions, particularly looking out for U-boat submarine activity, but there was no approval for Operation Postmaster. Once approval for the attack was received, M's next task was to gain the approval of the Admiralty. He had meetings with Ian Fleming, who helped smooth the way to get the Admiralty to agree. Their efforts were successful, gaining approval from the Admiralty by the 20th of November. Operation Postmaster had officially been given the green light in London. With W on leave, his second-in-command, Major Victor Lavasach, took over the planning of the operation. He had been very involved already and knew what needed to be done. It was agreed that the two tugs were required to tow the Duchess d'Aosta and the Lecombe out of the harbour, with quite a powerful one required to tow the Duchessa. The raid was to take place at night, during a moonless phase and after the harbour lights had been turned off, so between 11 p.m. and midnight. Due to the nature of the harbour, the larger tug would have to navigate the only suitable narrow channel. If the harbour authorities were alerted, they could easily block its exit. They would now need to have expert pilots. It was agreed that March Phillips would lead the operation, though W had his reservations. He was indisputably courageous and enterprising, but he could lack common sense. M overruled him and felt that with March Phillips and Appleyard working together, the mission would be in safe hands. March Phillips was informed, and the Maid Honour was ordered from Freetown to Lagos, which was some 1,300 miles away. Back in Fernando Po and with Mitchie, who was not one of M's agents, due to go on leave, M used this as an opportunity to place two of his SOE agents in the consulate, Peter Lake and B. Godden. Leonard Guise was tasked with measuring the chains in order to prepare exactly the right amount of explosives. It was essential a series of aerial photographs of the harbour were arranged, it seems by Mitchie, who took an apparent pleasure flight with the governor's pilot around the harbour. The photographs were used to provide further intelligence for the mission. He needed to have a diversion on the night of the attack. For this, Lippitt had to be creative. He decided the best way to lure the officers off their boats was to invite them to a dinner party, providing a good deal of liquid refreshment in the hope they would become somewhat incapacitated. Of course, this was a lot more complicated to arrange than it sounded. The British could not be seen to be involved at any stage of the organisation or have the payment traced to them, and Fernando Po is a very small island. The initial date for the raid was planned for the 22nd of December 1941, but due to the late arrival of the Maid Honour, which had suffered from these engine troubles and the lack of wind while sailing from Freetown to Lagos, it had to be postponed until the next moonless phase, which was in January 1942. From a planning point of view, this was no bad thing. London agreed to the plans and a new date was set for the 14th of January. Mitchie had now officially left Fernando Po to go on leave, but he met with Lavasach and Guise in Lagos before his final departure. They progressed with the final details, and it was decided that to speed up the operation, they should seize the ships simultaneously, which would require 2 cutting-out teams and 2 tugs. The Maid Honour, a Brixton trawler, was not an appropriate vessel for the task, and it was clear the SOE commanders could not do this alone. They would need to have additional manpower. There was a great deal to organise, including the tugs and the additional men. Gifford was approached, and so was Governor Bourdillon. Other preparations continued both in London and on Fernando Po. London prepared a cover story with the help of Ian Fleming, who we all know can tell a good tale or two. It was essential that no trails could lead back to the British. The Royal Navy would have to be involved in the operation. They were to supply HMS Violet under the command of Lieutenant Herbert Nicholas, who was to capture, in inverted commas, the Axis boats as part of the cover. Nicholas and his crew were not in on the story until it had set sail, when Nicholas was to open a sealed envelope with the real instructions. Lavasach, who remained in Lagos, was to send a dummy message to HMS Violet to go to a certain location to investigate unidentified vessels, boarding them and ultimately bringing them back to Lagos. The seizure was scheduled for the 15th of January 1942. On Fernando Po, detailed planning continued. With the original date changed from December to January, Richard Lippitt had been given more time to prepare, but it also meant his cover as an engineer at John Holt was wearing a little thin. He ordered a renovation work to commence at the John Holt premises, and funds arrived for this purpose, though the money had originated from the SOE. While in Lagos, he bought gifts, ostensibly to be used as Christmas presents for his network of friends on the island, for which he hoped to use to call in some favours. The officers of the Duchessa and the Lacombe were to be invited to a party, which clearly couldn't be at the invitation of the British. Lippet had become friends with a local Spaniard, Augustin Zorilla, who ran the local hardware store and was known to be anti-Nazi. Lippet came up with a cover story sufficiently convincing for Zorilla to agree to arrange the party for him. The Europeans on the guest list were all well respected and included a German couple, Herr and Frau Löhr. 30 people attended that party on the 27th of December, including all the officers of the Duchessa d'Aosta and the German officers from the Lacombe. The crew of the Duchessa had copious amounts of wine and spirits sent aboard. The casino restaurant overlooking the harbour was used as the venue for the party, which had an excellent view of the harbour. It was a great success, only finally drawing to a close at 4 o'clock in the morning. Zorilla nominally hosted the party, but excused himself a little early and asked the rather vain Herr Löhr to settle the account and made sure he had the appropriate funds. To all present, it would have appeared that Löhr had hosted the party. Lippert, of course, did not attend and retired to his hotel bedroom, having masterminded an ingenious deception. But this was only the dry run. Once confirmation had been received of the new date of the raid, Lippert had to set about organising another party. But this time he couldn't choose the casino restaurant with its view of the harbour. Lippert again persuaded Zorilla to organise the party, who in turn asked Frau Löhr to assist him with the plans, but this time somewhere a little less conspicuous, somewhere they could all really relax and let their hair down without being so much in the public eye. She proposed the Valencia restaurant and for this occasion persuaded the officers of the Akimbo to attend. Zorilla realised something was afoot, and while he seemed happy to help, sensed his safety was being compromised. Lippert discussed this with the SOE agents at the consulate, and they agreed it would be better for Zorilla and for them if Zorilla made himself scarce before the raid. This would protect him, but he could also prove a useful scapegoat after the event. Leaving the island unofficially was hazardous and could mean taking a canoe and heading to Nigeria, but it turned out to be a necessary precaution. Godden and Lake at the consulate destroyed every scrap of evidence should the consulate be raided in retaliation, which it was. All was ready, Lippert could breathe again, but then there was a setback. While the tugs were heading for Fernando Po, the Valencia restaurant cancelled their booking. The owner's wife had fallen ill. This was almost disastrous. So Lippert and Zorilla had to come up with another plan, and quickly. It was a small town, and the only alternative was the casino restaurant, which overlooked the harbour. Hardly ideal, but it was their only option. Fortunately, with only 2 days' notice, the restaurant was able to accommodate the large party. With no moon, the harbour lights out, and hopefully a lot of alcohol, and with an intelligently thought-out seating plan, the problem could be mitigated to some extent. With bright lighting at the restaurant and a very dark harbour, the guests could have poor night vision and would be unable to see what was going on in the harbour below if they happened to look. A long shot, but that was all they had at this rather late stage. Lippert also had to ensure the harbour lights went out on schedule or a little earlier than usual, and having given a rather nice diamond ring and a watch to the chief electrician via Zorilla, the electrician's wife agreed to arrange for the lights to be switched off a little early that night. Lippert had also arranged for some money to pass into the hands of the local brothel owner, perhaps to lure some of the crew away from the ship or to entertain the officers of the party. The seating plan arranged for the officers to have their backs to the harbour, and with Zorilla ensuring everybody was well plied with drinks, the prepaid-for party got underway on the evening of the 14th of January, 1942. Richard Lippert had drinks with a friend at the casino, then dinner at his hotel, before retiring to his room after an evening stroll. No one noticed Zorilla slipping away from the party at 10 p.m, and no one noticed what was happening in the harbour below. All it took now was for the Vulcan and Nuneaton to arrive on the 14th of January at the right time. The journey from Lagos had been tough. The sea in the Bight of Biafra was very rough, causing a number to suffer badly from seasickness. It took a couple of days for the sea to calm. Those on the Nuneaton suffered particularly badly. But this was not their only problem. The Nuneaton had recently had a refit, but its engines over oversized piston rings had been fitted, according to Bill's memoir. And with the Vulcan able to go at a much greater speed, the Nuneaton overstretched its engine trying to keep up. The Vulcan then had to take her on tow while they repaired the engine. A couple of days into the journey, Bill and Tony Abel, out on the sun deck, had been tasked with painting the Fulbert canoes grey, when the Vulcan suddenly swung to starboard and the Nuneaton began keeling over. It was on the verge of sinking. Leonard Gies and Bill clung onto the port gunwale so they could help Goodman, who was up to his neck in water in the wheelhouse. They prevented him from slipping into the sea, but couldn't save many of their provisions. The Nuneaton continued to be dragged along on her side until Bill saw a flash of an axe blade in the stern of the Vulcan. With quick thinking on the part of Anders Lassen, who had grabbed an axe and with a single blow cut through the tow rope, the Nuneaton was able to right herself, but it took some time to bail her out. They then continued on their own steam, but the submersion hadn't done the engine any good at all, and after 12 hours it was running dangerously hot. They had to stop once again to cool it down. They reduced their speed after this. On the 13th of January, some training took place, particularly for the volunteers, to ensure they knew how to use Bren and Tommy guns. March Phillips gave a full briefing to the recruits and assigned them their tasks. They were to capture and tow the Duchess of Aosta and the Lacumba as quickly and quietly as possible. The Babundi alongside the Lacumba would be taken as well if the opportunity arose. SOE agents Graham Hayes and Tom Winter, in the lead Fulbert, were to board the Lacumba, with the two amateurs, Tony Abel and Bill Newington, tasked with rowing the backup Fulbert. Having no experience, they needed some practice. Both tugs hove to and they paddled several miles of the shark-infested Atlantic. They then refreshed themselves with beer on the Vulcan. The Nuneaton came alongside for them to reboard. Bill went over the starboard side to retrieve the canoe, missed his footing and ended up in the sea. A couple of ropes were dropped down to slip over the bow of the stern, so the Fulbert and then Bill were successfully retrieved. Meanwhile, sharks were circling beneath Bill's feet, but they didn't attack. Brian Lett mentions this incident in his book, with SOE agent Desmond Long recollecting Bill wearing a pork pie hat to protect him from the sun and smoking a pipe, capsizing, and then swimming back towards the Vulcan, pushing the canoe in front of him, all the while wearing his hat and smoking his pipe, while failing to appreciate there's just gesticulations from those on board were warning him of the sharks, which were alarmingly close to him. Long said that Bill looked ashen-faced when he realized how close the sharks had been, but remained undeterred and continued practicing until he'd mastered the Fulbert. Whichever way you look at it, the incident involved canoes and sharks. By the morning of the 14th of January, the peak of Santa Isabel volcano was visible about 40 miles away. A couple of hours later, the engines were stopped and preparations were made. It was decided that Prout, one of the SOE agents, would remain on board to oversee the engine room of the Vulcan in case any panic was caused with the African crew when the explosives went off. By 5:30 p.m., the vessels were underway again. The idea was for the two Fulberts to go ahead of the tugs to give them time to board the Lacombe and to overcome any possible opposition. It was imperative they entered the harbour as planned, in the dark, once the harbour lights had been switched off. What March Phillips and Appleyard hadn't realised was that Fernando Po and Spanish Guinea kept Spanish time, which differed by 1 hour from Nigerian time. There was a heated exchange between Gies and March Phillips, who refused to accept there was a time difference, and his temper snapped, ignoring Gies, who then placed the Nuneaton broadside onto the bow of the Vulcan, making it impossible for her to proceed without ramming the Nuneaton. There were furious exchanges between the bridges of both tugs, but Appleyard, in his customary way, was able to calm the temper of March Phillips, and they waited until the lights went out. Lippett's groundwork paid off. The lights began to go out at Santa Isabel a little earlier than scheduled. The tugs entered the harbour, at which point they cut their engines. The discreet signal from the Reverend Markham's house, a blind raised and lowered on a light in the window by an unnamed someone, signalled the green light for the raid. Markham was away in Calabar. The two full-boats were lowered from the Nuneaton. They took guns with them, and Bill was carrying plastic explosive charges connected with fuses wrapped in paper inside his shirt. Abel and Newington somewhat groped in the dark, initially heading in the wrong direction until Guise called out to them and their course was corrected. The full-boats first came alongside the Babundi, where they met its African watchman, to whom Hayes handed a letter and bluffed that he'd come to see the captain. He was informed the captain was on shore, at which point another crew member appeared, but before any action was necessary, the second full-boat came into view, along with visible Tommy guns and revolvers, and the two Africans rather wisely jumped overboard. The two commandos with Abel and Newington boarded the Lacombe and started attaching the explosives around the anchor chains and crimping the detonators into place. They were not to blow up the anchor until the Nuneaton had arrived, coupled up and taken the strain. Bearing in mind there was little time to lose with the Africans swimming to shore to raise the alarm, they had to work very quickly. Goodman expertly steered the Nuneaton to its target. Once established, the Babundi was under German ownership, it was agreed to take her as well, though it would not make their life any easier. Due to the unreliability of the Nuneaton, it was decided they should blow the anchor chains once they were ready, rather than waiting for a signal from the Vulcan. Heavily armed Guise and Buzz Perkins first boarded the Lacombe to attach the hawser to make it secure, but Bill, who had been working on the plastic explosives with a commando, whom he noted lit the fuse prematurely, realized they were all in danger. They took refuge behind the bulkhead, while Guise and Perkins were less lucky. They were blown backwards, with a Mills bomb Guise was carrying blown out of his hand onto the deck about a foot from where Bill had taken cover. Fortunately, it still had its pin intact. Meanwhile, the Vulcan successfully came alongside the Duchessa d'Aosta, with the boarding party awaiting March Phillips' order to board the liner. There were lights on board, but nobody seemed to notice their arrival. While armed and ready, there was real hope force would not be necessary on the mission. The initial party jumped on board and Lassen secured a line, but the swell of the sea created a larger gap, making it hard for others to board. The opportunity was taken when the swell reduced and reduced the gap, and more jumped and boarded, with Appleyard leaping a full 8 foot. A bamboo ladder then made a precarious crossing for the remainder of the party. March Phillips gave the order to blow the cables on the Duchessa, creating an almighty explosion, which meant Lieutenant Leslie Prout in the engine room had to work hard to keep the stokers calm below decks. The Vulcan took the strain, but could not remove the Duchessa from her moorings. Geoffrey Appleyard realized the problem. One of the explosives had failed to go off. He called out that he was going to lay another charge, and his voice could be heard quite clearly from the consulate by the cathedral overlooking the harbour. He lay his charge with extraordinary speed and skill, dived for cover, and his final explosion released the Duchessa, creating an almighty noise. Meanwhile, anti-aircraft guns were being fired from the shore. In the darkness, they had no idea where these explosions were coming from. By the time the lights of Santa Isabel were finally switched back on, the Duchessa d'Aosta, Lacombe, Babundi, and the tugs, Vulcan and Nuneaton, were nowhere to be seen, shrouded in the darkness of the night sky. While the operation had worked pretty well like clockwork, their troubles were not yet over. The Nuneaton was towing too many boats, not only the Lacombe and the Babundi, but some smaller boats, which they cut free, and the Babundi was put on an extended line. By dawn, the pistons of the Nuneaton had seized up about 12 to 14 miles off the island, and they were drifting back towards Fernando Po. They worked feverishly to fix them. Had they been caught, they would have been treated as pirates or spies. They had another problem. The two ropes were damaged between the Lacombe and the Babundi, which was languishing 150 feet behind. A new line needed to be secured. On reaching the rendezvous area, but with no sign of HMS Violet, the Vulcan cut free the Duchessa, leaving their prize languishing, while March Phillips, having narrowly escaped death when misjudging the jump between the two vessels and landing in the sea between them, returned to check on the Nuneaton, which was still in difficulties. With German markings on her funnel, they were exposed to attacks from their own side, but he felt that leaving the Duchessa with no engine for any longer was more risky. So he returned and left the Nuneaton to chart her own course, which didn't go down too well with those on the Nuneaton. The Nuneaton eventually made the rendezvous area south of Calabar on the 16th of January, a day late, but found no HMS Violet, so continued towards Lagos, hoping to avoid being spotted by passing ships and aeroplanes. They were low on water and the engine problems persisted. They were still at sea on the 19th of January when a passing ship did spot them, and to their immense relief, it was the Nigerian government collier SS Ilorin. They communicated via semaphore, and Hayes had to ask the master to pass a message of their whereabouts on to Lagos. Then the following day, after another engine breakdown, they spotted the government ship SS Ajasa, whose master was a friend of Goodman's. HMS Violet had eventually managed to refloat herself, sighting the Vulcan and Duchessa 3 days later than planned on the 18th of January. They played their part by the book, firing a shot across the bows. The Vulcan was boarded and Mr. Coker was arrested by a sub-lieutenant who wasn't in on the secret. And on the Duchessa, March Phillips demanded to speak to the captain of HMS Violet in a clearly English voice. On board HMS Violet, a message was sent to Laversac. They then proceeded to Lagos, paradoxically arriving within hours of the beleaguered Nuneaton on the 21st of January. What happened to all these men, the ships, their crew, as well as the fuller international reaction after Operation Postmaster, is another story in itself. But for the few who knew about it, Operation Postmaster, amongst other things, gave a much-needed boost to the reputation of the SOE. Not a single shot had been fired. There had been no fatalities, only some bruises. An outstanding achievement considering the circumstances. I think it provides us with enough heroes and a story worthy of its own film script.